So he came out and said, we had a great meeting. We agreed on almost everything apart from one thing. The one thing, of course, was the war in Ukraine, which was meant to be the focus of the meeting. But by framing it in that way, Trump took the bait that they laid for him and allowed him to actually then come away thinking that Ukraine's a problem and that Ukrainians are a problem, and the problem is stopping us having this wonderful relationship with the Soviet Union's new incarnation, Putin's Russia.
Hi, I'm Jo Crawford and welcome to Times Radio's Trump Report. Today I'm joined by David Dunn, Professor in International Politics at the University of Birmingham. Thank you for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Good to be here.
So Zelensky is expected to meet with Donald Trump today, as well as with European leaders in Washington, D.C. Trump posted on Truth Social that Zelensky can end the war with Russia almost immediately if he wants to, or he can continue to fight. What do you make of this statement from the US president ahead of this meeting with Zelensky?
I think, unfortunately, what this statement demonstrates is what many people have long suspected, that Trump repeats the last thing he heard with the last person he was in the room with. And what we're seeing is him repeating the talking points from his 2.5-hour Bon Ami session with Vladimir in Alaska on Friday. And unfortunately, it's where we are dealing with the mercurial, short attention span nature of Mr. Trump.
I mean, it's been 6 months since we had that meeting between Trump, Zelensky, and JD Vance. It was seen as this huge showdown between them. How do you expect this meeting between Trump and Zelensky to go today?
Well, I think what we've had is a huge, long journey since the February encounter where Zelensky was ambushed. And there are several aspects to say about that because it's quite an interesting journey. And it's a roller coaster, but it always is with this administration. A roller coaster whereby a huge amount of effort has been put in by European diplomats, by European leaders, by members of Congress who are supportive, all to actually move the dial on relations with Ukraine. And we have seen a huge amount of progress up to last week, whereby Lindsey Graham and his bill in the Senate has, for actually putting tariffs on secondary tariffs on those who buy huge amounts of Russian oil has meant that actually we got to a point 7 days ago when Trump was saying, I've been played along, I'm demanding a ceasefire, I will not be happy unless I get a ceasefire, and if I don't get a ceasefire, bad consequences will follow. And then we had this remarkable event, and it's just absolutely worth unpacking. I just written a piece of the conversation on this, and the way in which the symbolism and the imagery and the actuality of a full superpower summit can actually change the dial, and to give the opportunity to Vladimir Putin to entirely reframe the war in Ukraine to his advantage, and therefore where we have a situation now is we have Zelensky going back to the White House, and it's deja vu, whereby we have now it's Ukraine's fault for this war. Ukraine could end the war if they were more willing, if they weren't more stubborn. It's Ukraine's ability to end the fighting, and it's Ukraine as the obstacle to that. And therefore, in a sense, we've almost come full circle. Not quite full circle, because the Europeans are going there as his diplomatic bodyguard. The Europeans are going there with the hope and expectation that we've just seen Summitry change Trump's minds 180 degrees. Maybe we can do the same thing again if we can be the last person in the room telling him what to think and getting him to repeat our lines. So it's an extraordinary wild ride that we're having with Trump, and it's the one where the end destination is unclear, partly because it's unclear in his own mind, because he hasn't really got much of an idea of where he wants to go to, other than to have the performativity of being seen to cosplay Ronald Reagan, to actually to have to pretend to be president, or he sees it as a role to play rather than an agenda to follow. He's not motivated by a clear set of clear policy goals or even an ideological proclivity. He's not actually someone who's motivated by those things. What he's motivated by is the way in which he is perceived. It's all about the way what he thinks he is perceived to be doing, his image in the world. I mean, Michael Wolff's latest book, the most profound line in there was when he asked Donald Trump why he wanted to be president, and the then candidate Trump said, "I will be the most famous person in the world." It's not because he wants to make the world a better place, or he has an agenda of how he wants to do that, or he wants to end poverty or inequality or even world peace. And even the world peace thing that he's picked up now is just so that he can get a gong from the Nobel Prize Committee. It's because it seemed to actually play to his sense of self, and that sense of self is motivated by self-image. So
Sorry, just from that meeting in Alaska, he came away with what he didn't want. He came away without being able to achieve some sort of deal. How do you think that's going to play out with this meeting with Zelensky? Ben Wallace, he said earlier that he thinks that Trump will try and blame someone else for the fact that he wasn't able to secure some sort of deal with Russia, and that he could turn on Zelensky as being the problem here, warmonger, like what we saw with the Oval Office last time. Do you see that as something that might happen this time?
yeah, and because what happened was that the opportunity to come to Alaska was seized upon by Putin, and Putin was able to reframe the war in Ukraine as the minor part of the bigger picture. And the bigger picture was there is a wonderful future of cooperation in digital technology and space technology and Arctic exploration and in direct investment, and particularly in superpower arms control agreements. New START expires next February, and so what Putin was saying to Trump was, we can have a major nuclear arms treaty that will cut nuclear weapons. If only we can get beyond all, in all these areas, we can have this great bilateral relationship. If we can only put the irritant of Ukraine to one side. So by framing it in that way, what you do is you actually tantalize Trump into all the wonderful things that will happen that make him look good, and that he can again play Ronald Reagan as his great arms controller, right? If only we actually pressure Ukraine into giving territory on our terms. So that's what they did. They actually employed statecraft and diplomacy to great effect against the hapless, unprepared Donald Trump in the situation, who was bamboozled by their flattery, and it was flattery, and it was all the rest of these things. So he came out and said, we had a great meeting. We agreed on almost everything apart from one thing. The one thing, of course, was the war in Ukraine, which was meant to be the focus of the meeting. But by framing it in that way, Trump took the bait that they laid for him and allowed him to actually then come away thinking that Ukraine's a problem, and that Ukrainians are a problem, and the problem is stopping us having this wonderful relationship with the Soviet Union's new incarnation, Putin's Russia.
Do you think we might get a better sense of what was meant when Witkoff said that there were some sort of security guarantees that Russia had in some ways agreed to? I think Witkoff said something along the lines that the US and Europe could effectively offer Article 5-like language to cover a security guarantee. Do you think we'll learn more about what that involves today?
What Russia came away with from this meeting was several things. First of all, they had the threat of sanctions, immediate sanctions and harsh consequences removed from them and pushed off into some never land. They had, remarkably, the pressure to agree a ceasefire taken off the table in favour of actually we have to have a proper substantive agreement and not a ceasefire on the way to that agreement. What that does is buy Russia an infinite amount of time during which they can promise anything, because the protracted nature of those negotiations and the details of those negotiations are so difficult, and because the parties are so far apart, that they will take years and years. And in the meantime, Russia hopes to win on the battlefield, and Russia hopes that America will get bored and stop supporting Ukraine, and that's what they have bagged as a consequence of this meeting. And therefore they could afford to make all sorts of concessions. Oh yeah, potentially we'll will agree to there being some security guarantee for the situation, as they did with Minsk One, as they did with Minsk Two, while they play the longer game, which is sticking to their maximalist goal of actually subjugating the entirety of Ukraine, removing its government, and denazifying the country in pursuit of their imperial ambitions to recreate the Soviet Union. So the idea that Russia is making a concession and this is a really meaningful thing to have happened is fantasy. What it is part of a negotiating strategy that's actually been very successful in the way in which they're pursuing things.
Depending on how this meeting goes with Zelensky, what do you think is the worst case scenario here, especially in terms of how this might impact the address with Trump and the European leaders today too?
Oh, the worst case scenario is terrifying. So, in terms of Ukraine, what the worst case is that Ukraine and Zelensky are blamed for being intransigent. They're the ones that are blamed for being the obstacles to not only peace in
Like
Ukraine.
an Oval Office 2.0 then?
Yeah, okay, but it's worse than that, right? Because the stakes are higher, right? Because what you got now is you've got the Europeans actually are now aware of that potential risk and aware of the consequences of that, and therefore there's a potential that actually there's a split between America and the Europeans. If the Europeans say, no, we're not accepting this, and if you're not going to be prepared to do it, we'll do it on our own. And then you've got the potential there of the Americans saying, well, actually, we want this to happen, and therefore we'll pressure you to do this, and that pressure can take the form of removing intelligence sharing with the Ukrainians, or it could be even removing the right to buy American air defense weapons like Patriot as a way of putting pressure on the Europeans, or it could be actually a case of the Europeans and the Americans falling out more broadly, and the Americans threatening to withdraw forces from Europe more quickly than they're planning to do already, as a consequence of, again, putting pressure on the Europeans. And of course, that's exactly what Vladimir Putin was actually preparing the ground for in his well practiced and well prepared statecraft in Alaska, by saying, yeah, it's really important that we look at the world bilaterally, and that we are the most important countries in the world. I mean, the line that Trump repeated, that he'd been fed by Putin, that we're number one, and and they're number two. Of course, it's a complete fantasy to suggest that they're number one and they're number two. But that's the way in which it was framed, and that's the line that he bought, and therefore that's what's driving his view of these things. And the Russians said, we mustn't let the Europeans torpedo this by their backroom deals. That was the language that Trump used in his 12-minute oration, or most of the 12 minutes after the actual meeting itself, that we mustn't let the Europeans do this. So you can hear him warning Trump, don't let the Europeans spoil things. It's a great future between Moscow and Washington. Don't let the Europeans get in the way. And there is a danger that this causes a wider split. So in terms of worst case scenarios, it's not just a worst case for Ukraine in the short term, it's a potential worst case for European security in the longer term.
We've been hearing reports that behind closed doors, Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, he to some degree believes that the Ukraine should give some sort of concessions in order for a ceasefire deal, peace deal to be made. Do you think that's shared amongst European leaders more widely?
I think there's a wide scale, wide acceptance that Ukraine cannot recover all its territory that has been illegally occupied and plundered by the Russians. And therefore, there has been, up to this point, a recognition that certainly Crimea, but actually probably also de facto, the 20% of Ukraine that has been occupied is unlikely to be recovered anytime soon. Right. It's what's interesting, of course, is that that and as that became accepted, as that became the quiet language that Europeans whispered, even if they didn't shout it. What you have is the Russians demanding more than that. Okay, well, if you've accepted this, do you know what? We'll ask for even more. We'll ask for the 30% of Donetsk that we haven't managed to conquer militarily. We'll demand that part of Ukraine where the Ukrainians have built their defenses. We'll demand not just that, but we'll stick to our position that we have to go to the fundamentals of the problem, which is the denazification, the demilitarization of the rest of Ukraine, and the insistence that they've also added back into the portfolio of asks that actually we demand the restoration of Russian language as a second language, as an equal language to Ukrainian within the country. So the Russians actually are getting more and more ambitious as the Europeans and the Americans seem to be moving towards their position, which of course reinforces the idea that the Russians cannot be satisfied even if we gave them everything they've so far conquered. So yes, to go back to your question, yes, there is an acceptance of the need for there to be concessions. The fear is, however many concessions you make, the Russians just keep coming back and asking for more.
And if we think back to that Oval Office meeting, a significant part of the meeting that many people probably didn't think would have come up in the first place was about Zelensky's outfit, wasn't it? And apparently it's been reported that the White House has been asking Ukrainian officials if Zelensky will be wearing a suit today. Do you think that that's going to be a point of contention here today?
I think what it demonstrates is the way in which the White House likes to call all the shots. What this is about them setting the agenda and them insisting that not only that Zelensky kowtow, but he's visibly seen to kowtow by what he wears, and that's not a good omen for the America's support for Ukraine or for European security or for the international rule of law or anything else, actually, that we've come to expect the Americans to be there for the last 80 years. What it is symptomatic of an attitude of dominance of in relationships with its former allies, who are now seen to be demanded to be supplicants. What's interesting, there was no sense of phoning rhetoric from Putin towards the United States. Yes, they complimented Trump on winning the 2020 election and the system was broken. But what you saw on the Russians' part is that we're a proud nation and and we demand equal status to the United States. And here you have a situation symbolized by this sartorial request that actually the allies bow to the demands of Washington in what they wear, even though Trump is often in a not wearing a tie, looking dishevelled. Looking. He wears suits that are far too big for him, to try and hide his expanded girth. And actually, J.D. Vance turned up at an airbase in the UK in his holiday garb. So there's one rule for them when it suits them, and another when it suits them as a way of actually showing their dominance in the relationship. It's not a good symbol. It's not a good look. And it's indicative of a trend.
And I'm wondering how J.D. Vance is going to approach this as well. Do we know if he's going to be there?
I mean, Vance is somebody who's interesting to watch, not least in terms of the way in which he is seeing an opportunity with regards to the Epstein scandal, and therefore whether he actually gets to be president rather than vice president by the end of this term in office. The very fact that Trump is 79 and got circulation problems with his ankles will also be not lost on Vance. So he is playing quite an interesting game in terms of not only trying to make himself popular with the MAGA base in terms of that Trumpian Republican support, but also actually making himself a player in this administration and making himself de facto the heir apparent. And therefore, I would imagine that he will absolutely want to be there because this is where the action is, and that's what he sees as his opportunity. Whether that's a good thing for Ukraine is another matter entirely. Of course, I mean, you probably also read the huge analysis of the February meeting in the White House and how that was largely sparked by Vance trying to actually get himself top billing and getting himself heading the agenda. And it was him that led the ambush and the bullying of Zelensky, and it may well be the case that Vance sees a similar opportunity this time round. We'll have to wait and see.
It would definitely be interesting to see what happens. David, thank you so much for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Well, it's been fun.